The house didn't get quieter overnight. It happened slowly, like the light fading at the end of the day, until one afternoon I realized I hadn't heard my front door open in 3 weeks. My name is Daniel Whitaker, and I am 85 years old. My children stopped visiting, and for a long time I told myself they were just busy, but the truth was harder and far more personal than that. I used to have a full house, 3 children, 2 dogs, a wife who filled every corner with her laughter. Sundays were loud and crowded with roast chicken on the table and someone always arguing about something small and unimportant. After my wife passed 12 years ago, the visits continued for a while. The grandchildren still ran through the hallway, and my daughter would stand at the sink drying dishes while telling me about her week. But life has a way of stretching people thin. Jobs moved them farther away. The grandchildren grew up. Weekends filled with other obligations. At first, the calls became shorter. Then the visits became occasional. Then they became promises. We'll come by next month, Dad. Work is just crazy right now. You know we love you. I did know they loved me. That was never the question. But love and presence are not always the same thing, and an empty house does not care about good intentions. I would sit in my armchair by the window every afternoon, pretending I preferred the quiet. I convinced myself that this was what old age looked like. Fewer voices, fewer interruptions, fewer demands. I told my friends at church that I enjoyed my independence. I even believed it some days. But at night when the dishes were washed and the television hummed to no one in particular, I felt something heavier than loneliness. I felt forgotten. What hurt the most was not their absence. It was the story I began telling myself about it. I started to think perhaps I had been too strict when they were young. Maybe I had worked too much. Maybe I hadn't listened enough. Old men have plenty of time to replay their mistakes. I would sit there and revisit arguments from 30 years ago as if they had happened yesterday. One evening, after another canceled visit, I did something I had never done before. I walked into the spare bedroom and opened the closet where I had kept their old school projects and drawings. I spread them out on the bed. Crayon drawings of our family, handmade Father's Day cards with crooked letters. A photo of my son standing on my shoes as I taught him how to dance in the living room. And I realized something quietly important. I had been waiting for them to come back to me, but I had not once asked whether I had made it easy for them to come. You see, after my wife died, I changed. I became quieter, yes, but I also became sharper. Every time they visited, I would comment on how little time they stayed. I would mention how rarely they called. I thought I was expressing hurt. What I was really doing was handing them guilt. Guilt is heavy. People and avoid places where they feel heavy. The next morning, instead of waiting by the window, I picked up the phone. Not to remind them of how long it had been. Not to sigh into the receiver. I called simply to ask how they were. I listened. Truly listen. When my daughter spoke about being overwhelmed at work, I did not turn it into a lesson. When my son mentioned the cost of travel, I did not say he would regret not seeing me one day. I just told him I understood. And then I did something even more difficult. I apologized, not for existing, not for aging. I apologized for making them feel that visiting me was an obligation instead of a joy. There was silence on the line when I said it. The kind of silence that carries surprise. My daughter cried first. She told me she had been afraid to come by sometimes because she felt she could never stay long enough to make me happy. My son admitted he avoided calling when work was stressful because he did not have the energy to defend himself for being busy. That conversation did not magically fill my house the next day, but it changed the air between us. Instead of waiting for them to plan a full Sunday visit, I suggested shorter things. A cup of coffee on a weekday morning, a video call just to see the grandchildren's faces for 10 minutes. I began sending small notes in the mail again, the way I used to when they were in college. Not reminders, just small stories about my garden or a memory of their mother that made me smile. I also stopped building my entire week around the possibility of their arrival. I joined a local walking group for seniors. I started volunteering at the library twice a week, or reading to children whose parents worked late. I made my life something that moved again instead of something that waited. And here's what surprised me. And the more I stopped clinging, the more they leaned in. My daughter began stopping by on her way home from work, sometimes just for 20 minutes. My son started calling every Sunday evening while he folded laundry. The visits were not as long as they once were, and the house is still quieter than it used to be. But the silence no longer feels like rejection. It feels like space. I had spent months believing my children had abandoned me. In truth, they were building lives of their own, just as I once encouraged them to do. I was the one who had quietly turned their independence into a personal wound. At 85, you learn that love changes shape. When they were small, love meant holding their hands as they crossed the street. In their teenage years, it meant standing firm when they tested boundaries. In adulthood, love sometimes means stepping back without bitterness. I still miss the noise of those old Sundays. I still wish time moved more slowly. But I no longer measure my worth by how often my doorbell rings. I measure it by the quality of the conversations we have, even if they are brief. If you were sitting in a quiet house like I was, wondering why the footsteps have faded, I want you to consider something gently. Sometimes the door is not closed from the outside. Sometimes we have unknowingly made it harder to open from within. Ask yourself whether you are offering warmth or accounting. Are you keeping score or are you keeping connection? I cannot promise that every child will return. And I know some distances are deeper than busy schedules, but I learned that releasing resentment creates room for something softer to grow. And softness, I have found, travels farther than guilt ever will. My name is Daniel Whitaker. I am 85 years old. My children did not stop loving me. They were simply waiting for me to meet them where they are now, not where they used to be. If you still have the chance, make that call without keeping score. The house may still be quiet afterward, but your heart will not feel quite as alone.